Chapter 7, Institutions, Policy, and Governance as Ethical Systems. Abstract. This chapter advances the argument that institutions are not neutral administrative structures, but moral environments that shape human behavior, dignity, and harm at scale. Building upon the foundations of quiet excellence, trauma-aware ethics, and violence prevention, the chapter reframes governance as an act of ethical restraint rather than control, and law as ethical infrastructure rather than mere compliance. Integrating organizational ethics, public trust theory, trauma science, and ethical AI governance, the chapter demonstrates how institutions either interrupt or reproduce violence depending on their design. Special attention is given to the governance of artificial intelligence as a contemporary test case for institutional ethics, where accountability, explainability, and contestability determine whether technology amplifies human flourishing or systemic harm. 7.1, Institutions as moral environments. Institutions function as moral environments long before they are experienced as bureaucratic systems. They shape norms of behavior, define acceptable harm, and signal whose dignity is protected and whose is expendable. Drawing on organizational ethics and political theory, this chapter affirms that institutions inevitably encode values, whether explicitly acknowledged or silently reproduced. When ethical intention is absent from institutional design, power defaults to efficiency, hierarchy, and risk externalization, often at the expense of the most vulnerable. Quiet excellence reframes institutional responsibility as the obligation to reduce harm proactively rather than respond reactively after damage has occurred. SOP 7.2, Governance as Restraint, Not Control. Contrary to dominant managerial paradigms, ethical governance is not defined by the capacity to control populations, but by the discipline to restrain power. Governance in this framework is successful when it limits coercion, prevents abuse, and creates conditions for voluntary compliance grounded in trust. This conception aligns with public trust scholarship emphasizing legitimacy, accountability, and moral credibility over force. Institutions governed by restraint foster stability, not through fear or surveillance, but through predictability, transparency, and ethical consistency. 7.3, Law as Ethical Infrastructure. Law operates as ethical infrastructure when it establishes clear boundaries against harm and provides enforceable protections for dignity. Rather than viewing law as an external constraint on morality, this chapter positions legal systems as the operational backbone of ethical intent. Where law is vague, selectively enforced, or subordinated to authority figures, violence becomes normalized through omission. Conversely, when law is accessible, consistently applied, and aligned with violence prevention principles, it becomes a stabilizing force for both individual regulation and institutional legitimacy. SHOT 7.4, Violence Prevention as a Design Problem. Violence is rarely the product of isolated moral failure. It is most often the outcome of institutional design flaws. These include unclear reporting pathways, power concentration without oversight, cultural tolerance of intimidation, and the absence of safe exits. Reframing violence prevention as a design challenge shifts responsibility from individual virtue to systemic accountability. Institutions committed to quiet excellence must therefore embed prevention mechanisms, clear complaint processes, independent review, proportional sanctions, and survivor-centered protections into their structural architecture. 7.5, Institutional trauma and repair institutions, like individuals, can traumatize. Betrayal trauma theory helps explain why harm inflicted by trusted systems, schools, religious bodies, governments, produces long-lasting psychological and civic damage. Ethical repair requires more than apology. It demands structural reform, acknowledgement of harm, and demonstrable change in power relations. This chapter asserts that without repair, institutions lose moral authority and perpetuate cycles of silence, disengagement, and latent violence. 7.6, Public trust and legitimacy. Public trust is not a communicative achievement, but a moral outcome. Trust emerges when institutions demonstrate restraint, accountability, and consistency over time. Attempts to manufacture trust through branding or rhetoric without ethical substance often backfire, deepening cynicism and resistance. Quiet governance prioritizes slow legitimacy, earned through ethical action, over rapid compliance secured through pressure or persuasion. SOP 7.7, Ethical governance across cultures. Ethical governance cannot be imposed uniformly across cultural contexts without reproducing colonial dynamics. While core protections, dignity, consent, nonviolence are non-negotiable, their institutional expression must adapt to local histories, values, and social structures. Drawing on Confucian, Buddhist, and post-colonial ethical perspectives, this chapter argues for adaptive universality, a governance approach that preserves core moral limits while allowing cultural translation. Failures to localize ethics responsibly, such as platform governance breakdowns in conflict regions, illustrate the dangers of ethical abstraction detached from lived context. 7.8 Ethical AI Governance as Institutional Test Case. Artificial intelligence governance represents a contemporary stress test for institutional ethics. AI systems concentrate power, obscure accountability, and scale harm rapidly when improperly governed. This chapter identifies explainability, contestability, and human accountability as non-negotiable pillars of ethical AI governance. AI must remain subordinate to human judgment and legal responsibility. No system may be permitted to override consent, due process, or dignity. Ethical AI governance is thus framed not as technical optimization, but as violence prevention at scale. 7.9. The Quiet Governance Model, Conceptual Framework. The Quiet Governance Model organizes ethical institutions around 4 governing principles. 1. Restraint, limits on authority and technological reach. 2. Transparency, clear visibility into decision processes. 3. Dignity, non-negotiable protection of human worth. 4. Trust, earned legitimacy through consistent ethical action. These principles intersect with institutional pillars, law, leadership, technology, culture, and identify ethical leakage points where harm is likely to emerge if oversight fails. 7.10 Global-Local Ethical Tension. Global institutions face persistent tension between universal ethical commitments and local application. This section examines cases where failure to adapt governance ethically without diluting core protections has led to large-scale harm. Ethical governance must therefore operate dialogically, allowing local actors meaningful participation in ethical interpretation while maintaining firm boundaries against violence and exploitation. 7.11 Institutions of Human Flourishing. Institutions designed for human flourishing do not maximize output, they minimize harm. They protect nervous system safety, uphold legal clarity, and foster ethical maturity among leaders and citizens alike. Quiet excellence provides a blueprint for such institutions, ones that operate without spectacle, domination, or moral exhibitionism, yet remain robust, lawful, and resilient. 7.2 Implications for Policy and Leadership. For policymakers and institutional leaders, this chapter offers a clear directive. Ethical governance is inseparable from structural design. Laws, technologies, and leadership cultures must be evaluated not by intention or innovation alone, but by their capacity to prevent harm, support repair, and preserve dignity under stress. 7.13 Chapter Synthesis. Chapter 7 establishes institutions as the decisive arena where ethics either scale or collapse. By reframing governance as restraint, law as infrastructure, and AI as an ethical amplifier, the chapter anchors quiet American and holistic healing firmly within real-world systems. It affirms that peace, trust, and human flourishing are not ideals to be proclaimed, but outcomes to be engineered ethically, patiently, lawfully, and without coercion.